In the world of classical music, there were names that everyone knew. They were the kind of names that were whispered and hushed. Reverent tones in concert halls from Vienna to Tokyo, these were the prodigies. The ones who could play a Chopin etude before they could write their own name. They had studied at the most prestigious academies, their fingers dancing on ivory keys with a precision that seemed almost inhuman. Every 3 years, these giants of the keyboard gathered for one event, the International Virtuoso Piano Competition. It was more than just a contest. It was a coronation. The winner didn't just get a trophy. They got $1 million and a recording contract that guaranteed their name would be etched into the history of music forever. This year, however, a name appeared on the list that made the judges and the journalists pause. It was a name they had never heard before. Ilara Vance. Ilara was not from the world of velvet curtains and standing ovations. She was from a place where the loudest sound at night was the wind whistling through the cornfields. Her town was a small, forgotten dot on the map of rural Ohio, a place where life moved at the pace of the changing seasons. Her world was shaped not by concertos, but by the rhythm of the local diner and the sight of fireflies blinking in the summer twilight. The heart of her world and the heart of her music was an old, scarred upright piano that sat in the corner of her living room. It was a piano her grandmother had rescued from a church fire decades ago. Its wood was darkened in places by smoke, and some of the ivory keys were chipped, showing the dark wood underneath like little secrets. The middle C key had a slight wobble, and if you pressed it too softly, it sometimes failed to make a sound. But to Ilara it was perfect. It was the first thing she touched in the morning and the last thing she touched at night. Her teacher wasn't a famous maestro. He was a kind, elderly man who had once directed the town choir and now spent his days tending his garden and giving lessons to the few children who showed interest. He never pushed her to be perfect. Instead, he told her stories. He would sit beside her on the creaky bench and say, "This piece? Beethoven wrote this when he was losing his hearing. Can you feel that anger? That fight? Don't just play the notes, play the fight. Or listen to this silence in the middle of the Chopin. That's not a pause. That's a breath. It's the heart taking a moment before it breaks." He taught her that music wasn't about hitting the right notes. It was about telling the truth. He always said, "Technique is the cage, Ilara. Emotion is the bird that has to fly. Don't ever let anyone clip its wings." She never planned on entering the competition. It seemed like a fairy tale, a world that belonged to other people. But one evening, after her teacher had praised her interpretation of a little-known Rachmaninoff prelude, she felt a tiny spark of something. It was a mix of boldness and desperation. She took out her old smartphone, propped it up on a stack of books, and recorded herself. The video was shaky. The lighting was bad. You could hear the hum of the old refrigerator in the background. She played with her whole being, her eyes closed, her body swaying. She wasn't thinking about the camera or the competition. She was just playing, telling the story the way her teacher had taught her. She uploaded it with a sigh, thinking it would be dismissed in seconds. And then she went back to her life. Meanwhile, in a sleek, modern office in New York City, the competition screening committee was going through hundreds of videos. They were a blur of perfect faces and perfect performances. They were technically brilliant, but they all started to sound the same. Then one of the judges, a young woman tired of the sameness, clicked on a video with a strange, unprofessional title. It was Ilara's. The video quality was poor, the piano was out of tune, and the girl's playing wasn't flawless. But there was something else there. A raw, unfiltered emotion that seemed to reach right through the screen. The other judges were ready to reject it immediately. "Lacks discipline," one sniffed. "Sentimental," another remarked. But as they were about to move on, the competition's founder and benefactor, a reclusive old tycoon named Alistair Finch, walked into the room. He was a man who had heard all the greatest pianists of the last 50 years, and he had grown weary of perfection. He saw the video on the screen and asked them to play it. He watched in silence, his old eyes fixed on the screen. When it was over, he didn't say a word. He just pointed at the screen and said, "Her, give her a spot." The room fell silent. They argued, but he was adamant. "I'm tired of machines," he said, his voice firm. "I want to hear a human." The acceptance email felt like a joke. Ilara read it 5 times, her heart pounding in her chest. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. It was a mistake. It was a scam. But it was real. With the help of her town, who raised money in a bake sale and a car wash, she bought a plane ticket for the first time in her life. The journey to the competition's opulent headquarters was a blur of overwhelming sights and sounds. The city was a symphony of noise she had never experienced. The competition hall was a palace of marble and gold, so different from the simple wood and plaster of her home. The other contestants moved with an easy confidence, speaking in different languages and dressed in elegant clothes. They looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She felt like a ghost, a country girl who had wandered into the wrong party. She clutched the strap of her old worn bag, feeling the chipped key from her piano in her pocket for good luck. She was an imposter in a world built for perfection, a bird from a small town who had accidentally flown into a gilded cage. And she had no idea that she was about to change everything. The air in the competition hall was different from any air she had ever breathed. It was cool and still, filtered and perfect, just like the music that was being made inside it. Back home, the air carried the scent of cut grass, rain-soaked earth, and the faint, sweet smell of the bakery down the street. Here it smelled of polish and old money. Ilara felt like she was breathing water, struggling to take in enough oxygen to keep her heart from pounding right out of her chest. She watched the other contestants from the shadows at the back of the hall. They moved with a quiet confidence, their faces calm, their hands resting gracefully in their laps. They were like beautiful, expensive statues. When they played, it was breathtaking. Their fingers flew across the keys in a blur of motion, striking every note with a precision that was almost scary. It was perfect. Too perfect. It was like listening to a computer program that had been fed every note of Chopin and Bach, and told to play them back without a single mistake. There was no humanity in it, no breath, no heartbeat. It was technically brilliant, but it felt empty. Ilara began to feel a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Was this what they wanted? Was this what music was supposed to be? When her name was called for the first preliminary round, her legs felt like they were made of lead. She walked onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her. The grand piano in the center of the stage gleamed like a black mirror. It was a world away from her chipped and scarred upright at home. She sat down on the cold leather bench and placed her trembling fingers on the smooth ivory keys. For a moment, she couldn't remember how to breathe. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the silent judging room. She tried to imagine she was back in her living room, with the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the soft creak of the floorboards. She thought of her teacher's words, "Tell the story." So she did. She played the piece not as a series of notes, but as a conversation. She let the music swell and fade, not just because the sheet music told her to, but because that's what the story demanded. She poured all her nervousness, all her hope, all her small-town soul into the music. She played with her heart just as she had always been taught. When she finished, there was a moment of silence. It wasn't the stunned silence of a captivated audience. It was a quiet, puzzled silence. A few people clapped politely, but it was a thin, uncertain sound. As she walked off the stage, she could hear the judges whispering. Later, she was given a sheet of paper with their comments. One judge had written, "Admirable passion but lacks discipline." Another said, "Inconsistent interpretation. Deviates from the score." The words felt like little paper cuts. She had poured out her soul, and they had found it lacking. They hadn't heard the story. They had only heard the mistakes. She had advanced to the next round, but just barely. It felt less like a victory and more like a warning. She was being allowed to stay, but only if she could learn to play their game. The next day, she was told she had been assigned a competition-approved coach. It was not a request. The coach was a stern woman with sharp features and eyes that seemed to see right through you. Her office was as clean and cold as the music Ilara was hearing from the other contestants. There were no personal photos, no clutter, just a neat desk and a gleaming piano. The woman introduced herself and got straight to the point. "Your playing has feeling," she said, as if the word left a bad taste in her mouth. "But it is wild, untrained. We must refine you. We must mold you. To win here, you must be perfect." Ilara just nodded, feeling small and out of place. The refining process was torture. They spent hours with a metronome, its relentless tick-tock drilling the rhythm into her head, leaving no room for expression. "The composer wrote a crescendo here, not a suggestion," the coach would snap, tapping the sheet music with a sharp fingernail. "Your personal feelings are irrelevant. You are a vessel for the composer's genius, nothing more." Ilara was forced to play scales and technical exercises until her fingers ached. The coach would stand over her, her arms crossed, correcting every tiny deviation. "Your wrist is too high. Your pinky is too weak. Your dynamics are incorrect." Day by day, Ilara felt the life drain from the music. The piano, once her best friend, her confidant, started to feel like a stranger. The notes were the same, but the soul was gone. She was learning to be a machine, just like the others. She was learning to be perfect. And she had never felt more miserable in her entire life. One evening, after a particularly grueling session, Ilara returned to her small, sterile room provided by the competition. She sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room pressing in on her. She looked at her hands, the hands that had once made music that felt like magic. Now they just felt like tools. A wave of despair washed over her, so strong it almost knocked the breath out of her. She felt like a wildflower that had been pulled from its home in the field and forced to grow in a perfectly straight line in a sterile garden. She was losing herself. She felt a hot tear roll down her cheek, then another. In a moment of desperation, she pulled out her phone and dialed the only number she knew could save her. It was the number of her old teacher back home. He answered on the second ring, his warm, familiar voice a lifeline in the cold, impersonal city. "Hello?" he said. Ilara couldn't speak. She just choked back a sob. "Ilara, is that you?" "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice full of concern. She finally managed to speak, her voice trembling. "They're trying to change me," she whispered. "They want me to be perfect. They say my feelings are irrelevant. They're making me empty." She told him everything about the coach, the metronome, the cold, perfect music. She expected him to say something encouraging, to tell her to be strong. But there was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his voice was not gentle. It was firm, almost angry. "No," he said, his voice cutting through her tears. "No, they are not. They are trying to break you. They are trying to put your bird in a cage." He paused, and she could hear him take a deep breath. "Ilara, listen to me. You listen to me good? Don't you dare. Don't you dare let them?" The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. "Don't you dare." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. It was the permission she had been desperately searching for. It was a spark in the darkness. "But how?" she cried. "How can I win if I don't play their way?" "You asked the wrong question," he said, his voice softening just a little. "The question is, how can you live with yourself if you do? Now, go play something. Not for them. For you. Play the fire. Play the truth." They hung up, and Ilara sat there in the silence, the phone still in her hand. The tears had stopped. In their place, a small, stubborn fire began to burn. He was right. She would not be broken. She would not be a machine. She would rather lose as herself than win as someone else. She walked over to the window and looked out at the glittering city lights. They didn't seem so scary anymore. They were just lights. She still had her music. She still had her truth. And she had a fight ahead of her. The phone call with her old teacher was a turning point. It was like a switch had been flipped inside her. The next morning, when she went to her session with the coach, she walked in with a new kind of quiet confidence. She still did everything the coach asked her to do. She played the scales with the metronome, her fingers moving in perfect, sterile time. She practiced the technical exercises until her hands felt numb. She was a good actor. She nodded and said, "Yes, I understand," when the coach corrected her posture or criticized her phrasing. But inside her head, she was somewhere else entirely. While her fingers played the notes on the page, her mind was exploring the spaces between them. She was listening for the silence her teacher had told her about, the breath between the notes. In her mind, she was not a machine being programmed. She was a storyteller gathering her material. She was learning their rules so she would know exactly how to break them. The semifinals were just a few days away. And the required piece for all remaining contestants was Frédéric Chopin's Ballade No. 1. It was a monster of a piece. A musical journey that moved from a gentle, mysterious introduction to thundering, heroic chords and moments of heartbreaking sadness. It was a piece that every great pianist had played, a test of not just technical skill, but of deep musical understanding. The other contestants saw it as a hurdle to clear with perfection. Ilara saw it as a canvas. She spent her nights not with the sheet music, but with recordings of the piece, listening to how the great masters of the past had interpreted it. But she wasn't trying to copy them. She was listening for what they had left out. She was searching for the parts of the story that had never been told. She thought about her own life, about the quiet struggles of the people in her small town, about the resilience of a piano that had survived a fire. She found the echoes of her own story in Chopin's music, and she began to weave them together. The day of the semifinals arrived. The atmosphere in the concert hall was electric with tension. The audience was filled with critics, agents, and music lovers who had come to see the future of classical music. One by one, the finalists took the stage. A young man from Russia played the ballade with a fierce, aggressive power that was technically stunning but felt like a battle. A woman from Japan played it with a delicate, crystalline beauty that was exquisite but lacked weight. Each performance was brilliant, a perfect polished gem. The judges, led by the formidable Maestro Valeras, nodded in approval. They were hearing exactly what they expected to hear, flawless tributes to a great composer. The music was beautiful, but it was also predictable. It was like looking at a perfect photograph of a famous painting. You could admire the craft, but you couldn't feel the artist's hand. Then it was Ilara's turn. She walked onto the stage, not with the nervous hesitation of her first performance, but with a calm, steady purpose. She wore a simple, dark dress, nothing flashy. She sat at the piano and took a moment, her hands resting on the keys, her eyes closed. The room was silent. She began to play. For the first few minutes, it was almost disappointing for those who had been intrigued by her before. She played it straight. Her technique was clean, her dynamics were precise. She was playing it exactly as it was written, with a discipline that would have made her coach proud. Maestro Valeras allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. It seemed the girl had finally learned her lesson. The wildness had been tamed. The bird had been caged, but then something shifted. It was so subtle at first that most people didn't even notice. In a quiet, reflective passage, she held a note just a fraction of a second longer than was written. It was a tiny act of rebellion, a single word spoken in a library. Then, in a rising melody, she wove in a faint, almost imperceptible dissonance, a hint of a blues note that didn't belong but felt profoundly right. It was like finding a familiar face in a crowd of strangers. She was not just playing Chopin's story of longing and heroism anymore. She was telling her own. The thundering chords were not just a storm. They were the anger and frustration she had felt in the sterile practice rooms. The soft, sad melodies were not just Chopin's heartbreak. They were the loneliness of a small-town girl in a big city. She was playing the fire that had scarred her piano, the resilience of her grandmother, the unwavering belief of her old teacher. She was playing the truth. The performance was no longer just a performance. It was a confession. It was raw and it was real. The music swelled and breathed like a living thing. The audience leaned forward, captivated. They didn't just hear the notes. They felt them. They felt the struggle, the pain, and the hope that was pouring out of this young woman and into the keys of the piano. When she played the final, cascading chords and the last note faded into silence, the hall was completely still. The silence was not empty or puzzled. It was full. It was thick with emotion, heavy with the weight of the story they had just been told. No one moved. No one breathed. Then a single person in the back row stood up and began to clap. It was followed by another, and then another, until the entire hall erupted in a roar of applause and cheers. People were on their feet, many with tears streaming down their faces. It was a tidal wave of raw human emotion on the judges' panel. Maestro Valerius sat frozen, his face a mask of shock and confusion. His hands, which had been poised to write a critical note, were resting limply on the table. He was a man who had spent his entire life believing in the sanctity of the score, in the idea that the performer's job was to serve the composer with absolute fidelity. What he had just heard was a violation of everything he stood for. It was disrespectful. It was arrogant. And yet, he could not deny the power of it. He had felt it deep in his bones. He had been moved, against his will, by a performance that broke all the rules. He was furious and he was fascinated. He looked at the young woman on the stage, taking a bow with a look of quiet humility, and he realized he was witnessing something he had never seen before. He didn't know what to call it, but he knew it had changed everything. The debate was no longer just in the judging room. It was now in the hearts and minds of everyone in that hall, and it was about to spill out into the world. The moment she walked off the stage after the semifinals, the world exploded. It wasn't a slow burn of recognition. It was a sudden, violent storm. The quiet, puzzled silence of the judges' room was nothing compared to the roar of the crowd outside. Reporters who had been ignoring her for days suddenly swarmed around her, a forest of microphones and flashing cameras. "Ilara, is it true you've never had a formal lesson? Are you trying to destroy classical music? Some are calling you a genius, others a fraud. What do you say to that?" The questions were fired at her like bullets, and she had no shield. She just stood there, small and overwhelmed, until a security guard gently guided her away. The next morning, her face was on the front of every newspaper. The headlines screamed at her, "The girl who plays with fire, virtuoso or rebel?" The debate was no longer confined to the stuffy concert hall. It was on the news, on the internet, and coffee shops. People were taking sides. Some saw her as a hero, a breath of fresh air in a stuffy old world. Others saw her as an arrogant upstart, a vandal who was scribbling graffiti over the works of the masters. She had become a symbol, an idea, and in the process she felt like she was losing herself again. She was no longer just Ilara from Ohio. She was a controversy. The days leading up to the final were a strange kind of isolation. She was the most talked-about person in the city, but she had never felt more alone. She would practice for hours on the final piece, a Tchaikovsky piano concerto, but her heart wasn't in it. The orchestra, which would accompany her, watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The conductor, a distinguished man with a stern face, kept his distance. She could feel their judgment. They were the guardians of the tradition, and she was the threat. In the quiet of her room at night, she would scroll through the articles and the comments online. It was a mistake. Every word, whether it was praise or condemnation, felt like a weight on her shoulders. The pressure was immense. It wasn't just about the $1 million anymore. It felt like she was fighting for the very soul of music. One evening, feeling the weight of it all, she went for a walk. She saw her face on a giant screen on the side of a building, looking back at her with an expression she didn't recognize. It was all too much. She went back to her room, her mind a whirlwind of doubt and fear on the night before the final. As she was getting ready for bed, there was a soft knock on her door. She opened it to find no one there, just a single cream-colored envelope lying on the floor. Her heart skipped a beat. She picked it up. There was no name on the front, just the competition seal. She tore it open with trembling fingers. Inside there was a small, simple card with handwritten words. The handwriting was strong and elegant, like a signature. It said, "Rehearsal Hall 3, 11 p.m., come alone." There was no signature, but she knew instantly who it was from. It could only be from one person, Maestro Valerius. A cold dread washed over her. This was it. The final confrontation. He was going to tell her she was disqualified, that she had brought shame upon the competition. Or maybe he was going to try, one last time, to force her back into the cage. She took a deep breath, the words of her old teacher echoing in her mind. "Don't you dare let them break you." She straightened her back, a quiet fire returning to her eyes. She would go. Rehearsal Hall 3 was a vast, empty space filled with the ghosts of 1,000 rehearsals. The only light came from a single bulb above the grand piano, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and rosin. Maestro Valerius was standing by the piano, his back to her, looking at the sheet music. He didn't turn around when she entered. "You play with a great deal of freedom," he said, his voice low and measured. It wasn't an accusation, not yet. It was a statement of fact, heavy with unspoken meaning. "You are disrespectful," he continued, finally turning to face her. His eyes were like stone. "You take the work of a genius, a man who poured his life's blood into every note, and you treat it like it's yours to change? You add your own little colors, your own little feelings. It is an act of profound arrogance." Ilara expected to feel scared, to feel small, but as she looked into the eyes of the most powerful man in her world, she felt a strange sense of calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't get defensive. She just spoke from her heart. "Maestro," she said softly, "with all respect the composers you revere. They were the rebels of their time. They broke the rules. They shocked people. They wrote the notes, yes, but they also left the silence. They left the space between the notes for someone else to fill. They left a piece of themselves for us to find." She took a step closer, her gaze never leaving his. "I'm not trying to change their music. I'm just trying to fill that space with everything I have, with my truth, with my story. Isn't that what art is supposed to be? A conversation across time?" Her honesty disarmed him. He had come in ready for a fight, ready to put this young woman in her place. But he was met not with defiance, but with a quiet, unshakable integrity. He saw not a reckless upstart, but an artist with a different kind of discipline, the discipline of emotional honesty. He saw in her the same fire he had seen in the eyes of the great composers he had spent his life studying. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the stone begin to crack. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "The Tchaikovsky," he said, his voice softer now. "It is a dialogue between the piano and the orchestra. Do not let them overpower you. And do not you overpower them. Have a conversation?" And with that he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the quiet hall. The next night. The final was a different kind of energy. The air was thick with anticipation. When Ilara walked on stage, the audience was electric. The members of the orchestra watched her, their expressions no longer suspicious but curious. She sat at the piano and looked at the conductor. He gave her a small, almost invisible nod of encouragement. She took a breath and began. The concerto was a passionate dialogue, just as the maestro had said. But it was a new kind of conversation. The orchestra would play a phrase, and she would answer it, not just with the notes Tchaikovsky had written, but with a depth of feeling that was entirely her own. She wasn't just playing with the orchestra. She was playing with them, engaging them, inviting them into her story. The musicians, swept up in her vision, began to respond. They played with a new energy, a new passion. The music became a living, breathing thing, a perfect fusion of the old and the new. It was at once familiar and entirely new. When the final chord faded into a breathtaking silence, the entire hall was on its feet, roaring, many in tears. Maestro Valerius watched from the judges' table, his face illuminated by the stage lights. A slow, transformative change was dawning in his eyes. He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had played these notes 1,000 times, and felt for the first time that he had only ever been scratching the surface. The final note of the Tchaikovsky concerto hung in the air, shimmering and alive, long after her fingers had left the keys. It was a sound so full and complete that it seemed to absorb all the noise in the world, leaving behind a perfect, profound silence. In that silence, Alara felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, a sense of peace. The weight of the competition, the pressure of the media, the fear of judgment, it all melted away. She had done it. Not the way they wanted her to, but the only way she could. She had been true to the voice inside her, the voice of her teacher, the voice of the little girl who played on a burned piano. She opened her eyes and looked out at the hall. The silence was broken by a single, sharp intake of breath from someone in the front row. Then, like a dam bursting, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a roar, a wave of sound so powerful it felt like it could lift the roof off the building. People were on their feet, shouting, crying, their faces illuminated by the stage lights. They weren't just clapping for a performance. They were acknowledging a moment of truth. Ilara stood up on shaky legs and took a bow, but the noise was so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. She looked over at the judge's table. Maestro Valeres was still sitting, but he wasn't looking at his notes. He was looking at her, and in his eyes, she saw something she never expected to see, a deep, profound respect. Backstage, the world was a blur. A kind stagehand handed her a bottle of water, her hands trembling so much she could barely hold it. She could hear the audience still roaring out in the hall, a sound that seemed to go on forever. She found a small, quiet corner and sank onto a wooden crate, trying to catch her breath. She wasn't thinking about the $1 million or the recording contract. She was thinking about her grandmother's piano, about the way the wobbly middle C key felt under her finger. She was thinking about her old teacher, and she hoped, wherever he was proud. She could hear snippets of conversation as people hurried past. "I've never heard anything like it," a man's voice said, full of wonder. She wasn't just playing the notes, she was speaking with them, a woman's voice replied. Ilara closed her eyes, a small tired smile touching her lips. She had spoken. And for the first time, it felt like the world had listened. The wait for the final decision felt like an eternity. The audience was asked to return to their seats, and a low, excited hum filled the hall. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. The judge's door remained closed. Reporters in the lobby were frantically typing on their laptops, their headlines already written. "The night classical music died," one might have read. Or, "The birth of a new legend." No one knew what was coming. The competition's founder, the old tycoon Alistair Finch, was seen pacing in a private hallway, a rare, genuine smile on his face. He knew he had made the right choice. He hadn't just found a contestant. He had uncovered a truth that the world of music had forgotten. The tension was so thick you could feel it. It was in the air, in the creak of the velvet seats, in the anxious glances people exchanged. This was more than just a competition now. It was a crossroads. Finally, after the longest deliberation in the competition's history, the door to the judge's room opened. The hall fell silent. Maestro Valeres walked out onto the stage. He didn't go to the microphone right away. He just stood there for a moment, looking out at the thousands of faces. He looked older than he had a few days ago, but also lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He walked to the podium and adjusted the microphone. The sound of it echoed through the quiet hall. "For many years," he began, his voice clear and steady, "I have sat in that chair. I have listened to thousands of pianists. I have judged them on their precision, their technique, their fidelity to the score. I believe that was the only way. The right way. I believed our job was to preserve the great works of the masters, to protect them from ourselves." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "But this week I was reminded of something I had forgotten. I was reminded that those masters were not preservers. They were rebels. They were innovators. They were not afraid to feel, to bleed, to break the rules. They didn't just write notes. They wrote their souls onto the page." He took a deep breath, and for a moment he seemed to be speaking only to himself. "We have spent so much time perfecting the cage that we forgot about the bird. We have become so obsessed with the notes that we forgot about the music. We have been curators of a museum when we should have been keepers of a living, breathing fire. A murmur went through the crowd. He looked directly towards the stage wings, where Ilara was standing, hidden in the shadows. This competition has been judged on many things, but tonight we must judge on one thing only: courage. The courage to be vulnerable. The courage to tell the truth. The courage to remind us that music is not about perfection. It is about connection. It is about what it means to be human. He took the envelope containing the winner's name, but he didn't open it. He already knew. He didn't need to read it. The winner of the International Virtuoso Piano Competition, he said, his voice ringing with a newfound conviction, is the young woman who reminded us all why we fell in love with music in the first place. The winner is Ilara Vance. The sound that filled the hall this time was different. It was a release, a celebration, a collective sigh of relief and joy. When she walked out onto the stage, the lights were so bright she could barely see. She felt the $1 million check being placed in her hand, but it felt like a piece of paper. The real prize was the look on the maestro's face. He shook her hand, and in that simple gesture she felt the passing of a torch. She didn't give a long acceptance speech. She just walked to the microphone, her heart full. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I just want to say that there is a little piano in a small town in Ohio with a few chipped keys and a lot of stories to tell. It taught me that you don't have to be perfect to be true. Thank you for listening." And with that, she held up the check, not as a prize, but as a symbol of a promise she intended to keep. In the years that followed, the Ilara effect was not just a headline. It was a revolution. Music conservatories, once temples of technical perfection, began to add new courses to their curriculum. The art of emotional authenticity, finding your voice within the score. A new generation of musicians emerged, no longer afraid to bring their own histories, their own cultures, their own truths to the timeless music they played. They saw Ilara not as a rule breaker, but as a door opener. As for Ilara, the $1 million was indeed life-changing, but not in the way people expected. She didn't buy a mansion or a fancy car. She went back to her town. She used the money to restore the old church where her grandmother's piano had been found, turning it into a community center for the arts. She started a foundation to provide instruments and lessons for children in rural towns, kids who had a song in their heart but no piano to play it on. She still recorded albums, but they were made in small, simple studios, filled with the same raw honesty that had won her the competition. She had not just won a prize. She had changed the conversation. She had reminded the world that the most beautiful music doesn't just come from the fingers. It comes from the heart. She had, in every sense of the word, changed everything.